Hello, friend, and welcome to Borgcast Original Series 1.15, where we cover the Menagerie Part 2. Previously, though, for Part 1, Andy got back to us, and in the United States, the death penalty was rescinded as unconstitutional in 1983, only for Reagan to overturn that in 1984. Yeah. In general, while technically there are 14 offences which can carry the death sentence, including desertion and mutiny, in practice it's only really applied to more extreme crimes which carry the death penalty in the US.
That makes sense.
I.e. murder, etc.
Yeah, okay.
And Robert Moneypenny had this to say, to add to what Andy said about the death penalty, it was on the books in the UK for treason, piracy and some military offences until 1998, but wasn't used. The last executions for treason even, were in the aftermath of World War II. Oh, and slash fiction is indeed sometimes called spurk, also I heard.
Okay.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
That was all from the Facebook page, by the way. If you want to join the Facebook group, then just let us know. We'll make sure we include you.
Yes.
There is somebody who's been on there for a long while, but I didn't recognise them at all, so I haven't...
No, there is somebody... If it's you and you're a real person and not a bot, do, I don't know, say something on one of our personal...
Give us an email at borgcast@gmail.com.
Yeah.
We'll make sure we add you.
Because basically it's somebody with only one follower who looked dodgy, so we haven't added them.
Oh, well, they're definitely going to contact us now if they just told them they look dodgy.
No, but but that looks like a bot. If it's a person with one follower, that to us looks like a bot.
Oh,
which
you
we
mean the
haven't-
picture doesn't look dodgy? That's the way he made it sound.
So no, it's an individual with only one follower. Yeah. That to us looked dodgy and made us think it's a bot. If it's a person listening to this, let us know.
If you're not bot, let us know.
Yes.
Anyway.
What are we like? Tired.
The Menagerie Part 2, yes, is credited as written by Gene Roddenberry because he wrote
The Cage.
Yep, and directed by Robert Butler, or at least he's credited it as it because he directed The Cage.
Okay.
But the extra material is by Mark Daniels, who did a lot of the last episode.
Right.
This is Mr. Spock. You'll learn next why returning Captain Pike to Talos 4 was worth risking my life and Captain Kirk's career. Join us then to see the conclusion of the incredible adventure on that forbidden planet.
Increase to full power!
Since you resist the present specimen, you now have a selection. Each of the two new specimens has qualities in her favor. You will find it an effective combination.
Don't, please, don't punish me!
You overlook the unpleasant alternative of punishment.
And our first trailer that hasn't got a voiceover by William Shatner, interestingly.
Oh, okay. Fair enough.
This is the only two-part in the original series. Roddenberry did want to do others, because obviously it saves on budgets for sets.
Yeah. And
But-
also sometimes the story's worth it.
But I never got developed, because
No.
it requires a bit more planning, I suspect.
Okay.
So
I don't know about his section, but mine's going to be bloody short. So you have a recap. And what I like about the recap is it mentions the phrase space disaster.
Oh, yeah, there's something worse than a space disaster.
Space disaster, yeah.
And it's a lot of it is reshot as well. This
Yeah.
isn't... they're not recycling footage. And I quite like the way they did that, actually. It's quite good.
It was all right as recaps go. Then you have... you find out that the Keeper has taken control of the ship, and that's how they're continuing to transmit. You get to see Pike in the cage. You watch the cage. What's different about watching the cage is that for us at least, I think they've remixed the sound, because when they're redoing Rigel and you have the roaring, with this setup, we really heard the speaker effect in a way that actually we didn't with the cage.
Yeah, it really came out the left-hand side. Which
Yeah.
is kind of maybe, I thought it was a dog initially.
So, yeah, there's a whole load of stuff that you've already seen in the cage. If you want to know about that, listen to our episode on the cage. But then you have it that it stops, and the reason it stops is that they know Captain Pike is fatigued. And the
Sleepy Pike is sleepy.
He is, and the Commodore's like, they care about him, and Spock's like, they want him back alive. Not quite the same. And then at one other point where they're showing stuff of the cage, they ask Pike, you were there as breeding stock, and he does his beep, yes. That's the sum total of my notes because everything else is in the fucking cage. You'll go.
Thank you. Well, just to say that when Spock butts in to provide commentary on the plot for the first time, because he does it several times, because there's quite a bit of the cage that's run up to that point, it kind of felt a bit Trial of the Time Lord.
Oh yes, it does.
Yeah.
But there's no Oxo woman.
Yeah.
And there's no Veil Yard.
Yes.
Which, I mean, the Oxo woman, that's okay, but the Veil Yard is...
Veil Yard.
Oh, whatever.
Knacker's Yard, or the other various of the yards it gets called, yeah.
Just that drives me bonkers about Trial of a Time Lord, more than anything else, to be honest.
Yes, it's funny, actually, I've just been re-listening to the Crinoid podcast's coverage of the Trial of the Time Lord stories. But Doctor Who, by the way, if you're not up to speed on that. Yes, very, very well worth listening to. But yeah, this is nowhere near as bad as Trial of the Time Lord.
No.
Yes, I mean, obviously that was 14 episodes long, and it wasn't about saving a budget. It was trying to save a series, and it didn't do a very good job of that.
No, it sank it, really.
Not quite, but yeah, pretty much. It certainly hold it under the waterline, let's put it that way.
Yep.
I mean, it's got its moments. It's not completely without merit, but it's not great. No, not really. Every episode of that, of 14 episodes, you keep cutting back. And just as you're getting into the story, it cuts back, and it's like, oh... Anyway, the footage we're seeing is back projected from the next set, by the way, which was Kirk's quarters, and had to be partially dismantled for this. It was these scenes that then were lost, meaning the cage could only be released in black and white from Roddenberry's personal work print. And then eventually someone at Paramount found a colour print, enabling us to watch it all now as originally intended. And I like the way that as the story goes on, Mendes gets drawn into Pike's situation. I mean, he was previously very against it in the first part, and didn't want to see the evidence and seemed very anti, and he falls basically in the process of this.
I think what I like as well overall, I mean, you get it I think more in your section than mine, but in this part it's definitely more present than the previous part, is that you see whoever it is behind all that Burns makeup playing Pike engaging more, having more alert head and body posture, more alert eyes, like as though Pike is now being more engaged with what he's seeing and what is happening than was previously the case.
Yes, no, and there's an amazing amount of emotion that he conveys just with his eyes, basically. So, yeah, no, I was quite impressed with his performance in this part. In the course of the second half, needless to say, Kirk can't help commenting on Orion's slave girl, Vina.
Oh, God.
Wait a minute, this has got interesting. And Mendes says they're like animals. Oh, nice. Next time we cut back to the trial, it's because the transmission from Talos 4 has ended. Ooh, it's broken. Kirk questions what sort of life Pike would have on Talos as a prisoner and lab rat. Mendes demands a verdict, and Pike beeps for guilty. He's then pulled out of shot. You see him go forward.
See him shooting backwards.
Yeah, so we can close in on the Commodore to get his verdict before Kirk has to do likewise. Hansen signals the briefing room from the bridge to say they've arrived at Talos 4. And then eventually the cage finishes, but the trial participants didn't get to see the credits, which is a bit disappointing. Then Mendes disappears, and the keeper informs them the trial was to delay the crew from overcoming the computer control. Right.
Okay.
That really doesn't work, does it? I'm sorry.
But there's more that doesn't work.
It only works if what we're told in court-martial is true and that only Kirk and Spock can program the computer, because obviously they are being kept busy by the trial, but everybody else on the ship isn't.
And I just find it really hard to believe that Scotty couldn't with enough time.
Yeah, although he was too busy on the projector, wasn't he?
Oh, God.
Yeah.
But he wasn't, because it was coming from Talos 4. He wasn't doing it.
Oh, no, what was he doing with that projector then in the previous episode?
Well, I don't know, but they say, don't they, it's all coming from Talos 4. That's what they say.
How very odd. Yes. Anyway,
And Mendes is invented or something. I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't understand
And
it.
at what point was he invented? Because, I mean, he's a real bloke, and they get a signal from him
they
from
get a
Starbase
message,
11.
yeah.
So at some point, Kirk was with the real Mendes, and then he wasn't the real Mendes.
They
And...
said it wasn't the real Mendes on the shuttle.
Yes.
So they're projecting
So on
from
the
bloody
way to the
far
shuttle,
away.
somehow... Yeah, and exactly the distance is involved. Yeah. Doesn't work.
No, sorry.
The invitation is given for Pike to return to the surface of Talos, where he can be restored by the Talosians. Kirk points out that Spock could have explained what this was all from the start, but the Vulcan tells him this was to avoid anybody else facing the death penalty, which does kind of work.
That works.
That's okay. Uhura then lets him know, she doesn't appear on the screen in this episode, just in the voiceover, that Mendes apparently watched the cage as well and has withdrawn the threat of the death penalty, or indeed any action against Spock, considering the circumstances. Does he have that sort of power to be able to do that just on his own? Blimey, these Commodores are well powerful, aren't they?
Yeah.
And-
Well, I don't know. I think that he does specifically because he brought the charge, so he's dropping it.
But was that the real Mendes?
Oh, I don't fucking
no.
know. Now you're confusing me even more.
Yeah, well, it just woolies the whole thing. Why didn't they just have it be a real person who wanted to put Spock on trial?
Who then changed his mind?
Who then changed, one was the one over as the fake
don't-
Mendes was.
Oh, I
That
don't
would have made
know.
far more sense.
It-
They made it too complicated.
I realise I've had a lot of beer and I'm very tired, but I don't understand and it does my head in.
Yeah. Kirk does the right thing in asking whether Pike actually wants to go down to
Yeah,
Talos.
good point. Yes.
And he gets the one beep reply. Then, for comedy effect, he berates his first officer for being so emotional about this, but Spock replies that he's been perfectly logical about the whole thing. And then Kirk watches a restored Pike, or Pike as he imagine he looks. I don't quite know how this bit works.
Well, I think it's supposed to be like Vina.
Yeah, so with Vina, she actually was all, put together wrong.
Yeah.
That's what she really looked like. But it isn't that she thinks she looks normal, but she isn't, because everybody else sees her as normal, as in how she used to look. So they're somehow able to transform people to look how they used to look. But they're not really like that. Again, this is all a bit...
I realise it's muddy waters, but my take on it was that Vina, when they had the technology to put Vina back the way she should have been, but not the relevant knowledge, which is why they got it wrong. They now have enough knowledge to put Pike back at least a bit as he would have been. Probably his true form is not what you're seeing on the screen, but I would be very surprised if his true form is still confined to that wheelchair.
So it's a little in column A and a little in column B, isn't it?
That's how I interpret it.
Because I mean, obviously, the whole thing isn't going to work if he's constantly in a wheelchair.
No, I don't think it does. I don't think he looks as restored as you see it in the same way, because if you think of Vina...
Yeah, she was able to walk and stuff, so they reconstructed... Because they're bipedal, so, you know, had she lost a leg, for instance, they'd know what to do with that.
So they know enough, to do the basics, but they didn't when they rescued or attempted to rescue Vina, they didn't have enough knowledge to get it completely right. So she was living and breathing. She didn't require any artificial support for anything like that, but she didn't look right because they didn't quite understand how she should look. And my thinking is that they know more now than they did then because of their experience with Vina and their experiences with Pike and whatever, but also, you know, at the end of the day, he's very, very badly damaged. I don't personally think that he's been completely restored without their layer of illusion, because I think if he could have been, the plot would be different, and it would be about taking him to a society that had advanced technology so they could restore him and send him back. I think he needs that level of illusion still, but he is able to walk and talk.
But I mean, this isn't really explained. As we said,
No.
you've got to work all this out for yourself, which is
It's
great.
reading between the lines, and actually an awful lot of it is coming from what I don't see in the Menagerie. It's coming from my knowledge of the cage.
Well. Anyway, I mean, all in all, it's a wonder when they reconstructed Vina, they didn't just put a butt on her head, really, because that's what they look like. But
Yeah, she does have a strange lump.
the fact this two-parter saved the production an entire week's work meant they got back on schedule, as they were in danger of missing out on the air dates, apparently. It was getting that close to the wire.
Right.
And both parts won a Hugo Award, so it was critically acclaimed. It almost works. I mean, it's a good way of watching the cage as far as I'm concerned, but I don't understand why it was necessary to make Mendez an illusion.
No, for me that doesn't work at all.
Overcomplicates things.
Yes, I agree.
And slightly disappointing there's no McCoy in part 2, presumably for budgetary reasons, but there we go.
Yeah, I think this, to me, this watches differently now we have the cage to see. But I think it's a very good job when the cage just wasn't there, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And to be honest, I still prefer this to the cage, just because there's more happening. The cage is a bit dull.
Possibly. I just am very confused by the whole Mendes thing, I'm afraid. It does my head in.
My head hurts.
Yeah, it hurts my brain.
How did other people react?
So, we've heard from Boss, who writes, I decided to watch and feedback on both parts together, as most of part 2 is a rewatch of the cage and I wouldn't have had much to say about it on its own. Yeah, we should have thought of that, sorry.
Although we'd have plenty to say as it turned out, so...
Having recently seen the cage, this episode doesn't really work for me. I know why Spock's doing what he's doing from the start, and the mystery that forms the basis of this is what forms the basis of the original scenes. Yeah, that's true. If you know the cage, it does lose something. I
suppose so.
I think it's different if you've not seen it. It probably worked quite well at the time because the original pilot hadn't been broadcast and CBS would not have managed to get a 2-part original story on the cheap. I was also watching after getting to know Captain Pike via Discovery, so the tragedy of his accident has a little more emotional punch than it would have done if we'd just been introduced to him. Yeah. It was also noticeable how Leonard Nimoy's portrayal of Spock has changed since the pilot.
Just a bit.
It is, and I think that's where Discovery is coming from in how Ethan Peck's portrayal of Spock is different.
Yeah, well, it was that whole mini-sode thing, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Which doesn't work because they're in the wrong uniforms. But anyway.
I'm just not that aware of uniform things. I get that if you're aware of it, you're aware of it. You can't unsee. I understand that as a concept, but for me, it doesn't bother me because I'm not that aware of those things.
It doesn't. The thing they came up with there is like, number one pretends not to be emotional, so Spock copies. That's not Spock, is it? Really?
No, he's got a different motivation for his lack of emotion.
So I found that poo as well, I'm afraid. I mean, ultimately, you don't need to explain it. This was a pilot.
Yeah.
Pilots are different. We can live with that, okay?
Yeah.
It's a reality of TV.
It is, but there is a growing trend, and I don't know where it's coming from. Is it coming just from the fans? Is it coming just from executives? Is it incels in their basements? I don't know. But where everything has to have continuity and you can't have a pilot that doesn't fit.
Although, I mean, that's always been the case because people back in the day wrote tie-in novelizations about Pike and the crew and stuff. So back in the day, they weren't making TV programs about Pike, but there were still people writing books and stuff and trying to tie it all in. And the books were all, terrible for constantly just characters would just turn up from other episodes just so that things would tie in nicely. So it's always been a thing with fans.
Okay, fair enough. The worst fan thing, by the way, that I've ever come across is Star Trek Nemesis. Just thought I'd put it out there. Anyway, Boss continues. The courtroom scenes are not as interesting as with the previous episode because they're basically people watching the telly, but at least the Commodore was wearing a gold top this time.
Yes.
I did wonder why Scotty seemed to be watching the footage via the viewfinder in his device rather than just looking at the big screen. He's like one of those people who go to a concert and watch the whole thing on their phone. It was nice for Captain Pike to get a happy ending.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Boss.
And we've heard from Doreen.
Star Trek's Menagerie. What a load of clip show. Certainly seemed to be a menagerie of caged clips, all held together by a terrible framing narrative. Do these writers not understand who Spock is? He's full of humanity. He wouldn't do this. Oh, by the way, I had watched part 1 before your podcast, and I did keep trying to record about it, but I hadn't the foggiest what to say. I have to say, having listened to your podcast and then rewatched part 1 and part 2, I would definitely say that part 1 was far more enjoyable, having listened to your discussion about it. Like, were they not satisfied by making Pike a complete like that his duty would paralyse him and disfigure him. And Anthony thinks that he looked a bit like a Dalek from Doctor Who. Like, are the writers not happy enough with that? Do they then have to go and have him in the courtroom, the court drama, and be forced into, through his duty, into mental torture as well? Because that's what those beings do. But he may actually be slightly safe from them, because I was wondering about your discussion about the one buzz for yes and the two buzzes for no, and why they're not using Morse code. You get that locked-in syndrome or something that I've heard about, and people are totally aware, but their body won't do what they want. And speaking as someone with a neurodiverse brain, like, if all the computer software and hardware is built for healthy brains and normal brains, if Pike's brain is so rewired by his accident, perhaps he can't control it to do anything other than yes and no. So possibly, even though those beings in the world with the death penalty, even if they think that they've finally got their complete menagerie and they can control them, perhaps his different brain will actually allow him to fight against them. I know it's probably not true, but I'm going with that as my headcanon so that I can move on from these episodes. I think that the writers should have left the cage alone and just left it. Anyway, thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, the bottom line is they weren't going to leave the cage alone because they wanted to make use of the fact that they'd filmed it.
Yeah, they couldn't.
And they couldn't show it as it was because
they didn't have all of it.
Star Captain Kirk for starters.
But they didn't actually have all of it.
They did have all of it.
No, I thought some of it was.
No, it was only afterwards it got lost.
Okay.
Ironically, in the making of this.
Oh, wow.
But before that, they had all of it, but they couldn't show it because it didn't fit with the series that people had seen up till now. Because the second pilot was not radically different, but, it had a different captain, and they changed the sets and they changed the uniforms, and most of the characters were different. So, yeah, basically they had to have some sort of framing device in order to reuse that footage, but they weren't going to just leave it gathering dust on a shelf because it costs money. Also, as I explained, they had an issue with they were running out of time and needed to save some time. So by having this two-parter, which reused loads of footage from they'd used for the first pilot that was never broadcast, so it wasn't a clip show. People had never seen this stuff before.
And I think that's important to remember. For us, it's a clip show.
Yes, it is.
We've seen
now.
the cage.
Yeah.
For the viewers, originally, it wasn't.
Yeah.
In terms of your comments about both Morse code and being neurodivergent, I find them very interesting for two reasons, but they're different from each other. So, number one, if you're just thinking of the people writing at the time and what knowledge they had then it might make sense that maybe he couldn't get his body to cooperate enough to do more than, it was really tiring for him, for example, to do more than yes and no, and he couldn't do Morse code from the understanding at the time they had trying to extrapolate in terms of technology. In terms of now, what's available is something called eye gaze. Now, it was originally designed for, very specifically, neurotypical adults who had lost motor functions, like Stephen Hawking, who at one point didn't have a disability and then had motor neuron disease and then progressed, and so he had a neurotypical brain. He was bloody intelligent, but he had a neurotypical brain and his body deteriorated, and that's what it was based on, was people like him. But they have very successfully, something like 7 years ago now, trialled eye gaze with children with various different disabilities. This is physical disabilities, but some of whom were also neurodivergent, and they have made this technology programmable. So it is now possible for children who are both neurodiverse and have a physical disability to use eye gaze technology to communicate way beyond what you might have expected. They could not have predicted that back in the 60s, but I'm afraid that because I'm aware of the technology, because I used to be a governor of a special school that was trialling this stuff, I find it very difficult not to read my knowledge into that, given that this is set in my future. And I think this is a difficulty with any science fiction that is supposed to be in our future, but was written in our past.
There we are. Well, thank you, Doreen.
Thank you. What did the llama god think?
Longers, got the Fixia, yeah. Where is the horse and the rider? And before I get into my feedback for this week's episode, I just need to address something from a couple of your podcasts back, because I'm somehow once again behind. When I mentioned in my feedback to Court Martial that I heard womb music, no, that wasn't womb music as such, that was white noise. So in order to help the scraplet sleep properly, we play him white noise every night. Now, obviously being a good geek, the white noise that we should have picked should have been 24 hours of background sound effects from the Enterprise Warp Core or something like that. We'd also found white noise that basically emulated the sound that someone somewhere thinks that developing babies might hear in the womb. So yeah, so it's just hissing white noise, but over the sound of that is a heartbeat, because obviously a developing child in the womb would hear their mother's heartbeat, and also sort of rushing fluids as to kind of emulate, I guess, the sound you might hear of rushing blood and noise that would pass through the amniotic fluid. So it's that kind of thing. It's not womb music, it's just white noise that's meant to emulate the sound of being in a womb, as far as anyone can figure that out. Anyway, I don't know whether anyone stuck a repurposed microphone up into anyone's womb or not to figure this out, but yeah, that's what it is. So yeah, it's not that strange, except maybe a little bit strange. Now, that may feel like it's padding the time a bit, but really that's kind of apt for this episode, isn't it? Whereas last week the extra scenes that were inserted into the first part of the Menagerie helped to flesh out some of Spock's character and give some background, this episode the scenes really are perfunctory, aren't we? This is what, 90% the cage, and now that we're actually holding the trial, or not really, but now that the trial is going ahead, with Spock forcing them all to sit down and watch TV, it's certainly starting to just feel a little more contrived and lazy, and there's not a lot going on, except every so often the television broadcast is interrupted to allow for commercial breaks, to allow for deliberations or for some other reasons or something, and then we get back to it. It's just a plain retelling, isn't it? And there's not really a lot to be said about this. There is the nice bit at the end where Kirk asks Spock why Spock didn't come forward and make the request to Kirk himself directly, and the answer is, obviously, if he hadn't done that, they wouldn't have been able to get away with reusing this much stock footage. So there's not really a lot to say about this episode itself. It's nice to see the Tellusions again. The Tellusion brain effect looks really weird and icky. I think I commented back on the time when they re-implemented these in Discovery, is that the CG version of the Tellusions that we saw in Discovery were nowhere near as icky as the Tellusions we actually get here with practical effects, with their pulsating veins on their bulbous heads, and the idea behind them is slightly unsettling, and a high concept one as well. The whole idea of the Tellusions being so mentally powerful that they can convince the crew of the Enterprise to see anything and to even blow the ship up themselves by pressing the wrong dial is a very powerful, strong concept. But what we're learning new about them in this episode is the extent of their mental powers. They were able to reach all the way to the nearest starbase, which isn't that nearby, and we learn they're able to project the whole idea of the Commodore into Kirk's mind from so far away that you've got to wonder what is the extent of their powers, and could you go so far as to questioning how much of Star Trek is actually real after this point, or even before this point? Is the entirety of Star Trek just taking place in the Tellusion's mind? Actually, that's not such a bad question, because that's a really good way of justifying why, when we have prequel series like Discovery, that the special effects and sets look so much better. It's because the Tellusions upgraded their mind powers. There you go. Any continuity errors? That's the Tellusions getting it wrong or fucking with you. The one potentially good thing that this episode does do, when altering the end of the cage, is at the end of that episode, the denouement, where we discover that Vina is actually old and horribly injured, and the important thing is that they give her back her beauty. Yeah, okay, I guess that is probably ableist, ageist, and sexist, and you could just say it's the 60s, but yeah, still, I think it deserves commenting on. And at the end of the cage, she's just given a fantasy to play with for the rest of her life, and yeah, I guess that's a questionable end to that character, isn't it? This episode instead sees Pike and Vina reunited, which is slightly nicer. Potentially less of a problem with giving Pike a new imagined life, given that his actual quality of life strapped in that wheelchair isn't particularly good. Although I'm not one best placed to comment on these things, and maybe there is an element ableism there, I'm not entirely sure. It seems that the intent was to show that, given that he did have a poor quality of life, that he could go off and at least have something of a future, even if imagined, with Vina. Which, of course, it does make you start to think laughing and posing the question, is it real if it's only happening in your mind? And that's a question for a whole series to dwell on, I'm sure, at some point. Although, of course, the question is whether they would actually remain happy together. After all, earlier in the episode when Pike is asked if he's seen Orion slave girls before, Pike's answer is one of the longest singular beeps that we've seen in the episode, yes. So, yeah, there's definitely some desires going on there. And speaking of Pike's desires, we've been reminded twice this week that Pike likes riding horses. In this episode, of course, we see him with his tuna chicken sandwiches and the horse that he's about to set off riding, and it features prominently on the rather beautiful new poster that was released a couple of days ago for Strange New Worlds. And this does really all beg the question, is it a requirement that every Captain Enterprise has to be an avid horse rider? So we've got Pike here, and then we've got Kirk, and then we've got Picard. Did Spock have to ride horses when he took over captaincy of the Enterprise? Did Decker? Was Decker able to entirely, given the slight impediment of his Decker unit? Is this why Harriman was such a bad Captain Enterprise, that he wasn't a horse rider? We need to know these things. Obviously, a lot of that actually comes from the fact that they gave Picard the horse riding stuff, probably because they didn't know what to do with Picard during season 2, I think the episode with Only Likes Horse Riding. And Kirk's horse riding actually retroactively came from William Shatner himself having a love of horses, so there you go. But still, all the same, bit of a coincidence, isn't it? Anyway, as ever, I'll be interested in eventually hearing what everyone else has to say about these things. I hope that everyone else is safely and privately enjoying their own suitcases full of Romulan ale, and until next time, glory to you and your cast.
Thank you. Enjoy your womb groove.
Yeah.
Interesting captains riding horses. I don't think Sisko was ever into horses, was he?
No.
There you go. So not everyone.
No, but he did say the Enterprise. I've tried Googling Captain Archer riding a horse.
Yeah, I don't think there's a budget for that on Enterprise, did they?
And I wonder if maybe he didn't, because I can't find anything. So, because Sisko never captained the Enterprise.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah,
right? Yeah. So, but Archer did, and I can't find anything that says he rode horses.
And what's his name? Harriman couldn't because it wasn't arriving till next Tuesday.
Yeah. The horse hadn't arrived yet. Yeah, okay. Who else has captained the Enterprise that we know of?
There was the one in the Enterprise C who didn't last very long. I seem to remember she died quite early on, didn't she? So
maybe she died because she couldn't ride a horse. I suspect that the Pike horse riding is a Gene Roddenberry thing, and that's why it's also as part of Kirk.
Yeah.
And therefore Gene Roddenberry wrote it also as part of Picard. That's my guess. It's
I think it's probably coming from Gene. I mean, yes, I know Shatner was a keen horse rider, so that was all right. But
it would make sense, wouldn't it, if it came from Gene for those three?
Yeah, because I can't see Patrick Stewart ever suggesting it as a character trait. So yeah,
no, not really.
Yeah, that Strange New Worlds poster, I must be the only person who doesn't like it, because I never like seeing a ship like that in an atmosphere. It doesn't look right at all. They shouldn't be there. So it's like, I mean, presumably it's just being imagined anyway, but it was a bit like the Discovery first episode when they brought the ship into right down to the planet. It's like, no, those ships aren't supposed to be in planetary atmospheres. Not the idea. Never mind. Why have transporters or shuttles, for heaven's sake? Anyway.
That's a good point. And also, I'm not being funny, but I always thought they were too fucking massive for that. In the same way as
it's not just they're massive, but the weights allocation. You think about the Enterprise, for instance. I mean, that scene that I nearly walked out of watching the Star Trek reboot film out of, because those warp nacelles are never going to be held up by those tiny pylons in a gravity. Fine, out in space, where it's supposed to be built and
because there isn't gravity, you're fine.
Anyway, don't get me started on that again.
Okay.
And Spock rode horses in Star Trek 5, so that's okay. Yes, he can captain the Enterprise.
Spock. Yes, Captain. The one with the horse. Yes, Captain.
Yeah, I have seen Star Trek 5 enough for probably the next 10 years.
Oh, it's been ages. Ages. May have been as much as a year now. I'm getting withdrawal symptoms.
Oh, fucking
anyway,
hell.
Let's move on from Star Trek 5.
Yes, please. Who else we heard from? Have we heard from Drew and Tracy?
We have indeed.
So that was part 2 of the Menagerie.
Yes.
And what do we think about that one then?
Yeah, it's alright.
Seen it before, said it before.
Yeah, exactly.
Gonna struggle with this one to find anything new.
Okay, well, a couple of things I think didn't say before, which I've thought about. You know, the when it turns out he has been shooting the glass wall thing, and there's a hole in there.
Yeah.
And also the same when they're shooting the lift at the top, and Boyce actually says, it might all be an illusion. I think it might have worked.
Yeah.
No one goes up and checks to touch it.
Yeah, but what would be the point if they've impressioned their minds to think that it hasn't worked? They're not going to see anything different. It's only when Pike challenges the bumhead that
and threatens her, that she actually lets him see reality.
I can slightly understand with the lift, they might have not gone up and touched it, but they must have touched the glass at some point, unless, like, in the next 10 minutes, they also illusioned it so they didn't notice them changing the glass, maybe. I don't know.
I mean, not being funny, though, the room is very small. At least one of them's going to go up and lean on the glass at one point. Surely they would have fallen through.
Yep.
I don't think we talked about Green Vina before.
You know what? When they're watching the playback, the dance goes on for a long time.
That's the longest scene in this show.
Kirk's like, can we just record this bit, please?
Can we just go back to the beginning, because I don't think I saw enough of like Green Vina.
We need to watch that bit again.
That is definitely what Kirky was saying.
I think Mendes says to Spock, why can't you just tell us? And Spock says, oh, you wouldn't believe it. And Kirk says at the end, you could have told me, and Spock says, oh, only one of us should face a death penalty.
Yeah.
He could have just said, okay, I'm going to level with you. Tell us they've got these people and they can make Pike's life be normal, like in inverted commas normal. That's why I'm trying to get him back. It's all this, like the whole episode of deception.
There wouldn't have been a fucking two-part if they could have said that in the first 10 minutes of the first episode, dear.
It's also a bit like, when Mendes disappears and, we had to do the court-martial illusion, Kirk, because you're so strong-willed. It's like, what?
Well, that's just blowing smoke up Kirk's ass, isn't it, to be honest?
Yep.
But I did say this was very progressive when, obviously, Pike is off on Talos 4 and they have number one
in control. Yeah.
I just thought that was really, really like
it's good.
A powerful scene to have her in control and like leading, basically a group of men.
Yeah,
because that was very progressive for like, what is it? What did we say? 1960? I'm sure we'll get corrected on this, but 67 maybe. But I thought that was really good.
The end when Pike actually goes down. And, he goes to leave there. So for the whole of, like, the episode, he's been like, oh, we'd rather die than be in the cage. But then, oh, no, I'm going to actually do it.
Yeah, but there's a difference, isn't it? Because when he's on Talos 4, he thinks that he's just beamed down from the Enterprise and he's full of health and life. But actually, in reality, he's being pushed around by Spock in a little cart.
Yeah, the end when he's like, Spock, will you just help Pike? Oh, I'll help her, pushing him out.
Let's go back. So throughout the two episodes, he's been saying, no, Spock is guilty. He's guilty. And then right at the end, he's like, oh no, but you were doing it for my own good, and now I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna like not be in this wheelchair and gonna live my happy life with Vina. So you could have fucking done that and like, halfway through the first episode and realised that Spock was doing it for your own good.
Yeah. I think all in all, you've just seen this so many times, the Menagerie and the Cage. I just don't think it's a brilliant episode. It's alright, it's okay, but I think it's a bit boring, a bit tedious to keep watching it again and again.
I think it was fun the first time we watched it, especially with the bumheads and like the pulsating brain and all that lot. But you just find too much fault with it.
It's not got longevity, has it? It's not up to multiple views.
No. But I have to say, Kirky did look very handsome in this episode, so I was quite happy. But in terms of like keeping us entertained, it was just another one where I started like drifting off.
Yeah,
seen it before. I'm not that interested. Yeah.
Well, onwards, upwards to the next episode.
Let's hope so. Anyway, leave it there.
Okay.
Take it easy, guys. See you later.
Bye.
Bye. Yeah, again, you're struggling to sort of maintain attention and whatever because we've seen The Cage. And it's worth remembering that the people who saw this had not seen The Cage, so it would have been received very differently compared to how we're receiving it. But I do think that certainly towards the end, certainly in part 2, possibly not in part 1, but definitely in part 2, they did actually get to a point where Spock could have just gone, yeah, I can explain it now.
Yeah, kind of. But, I mean, by not explaining it, he does make sure that, nothing can be pinned on Kirk. So...
Okay.
It kind of stands up, that explanation.
I don't know. I'm not. I think he does in part 1. I think the whole concept is so strange, they need to see it. But I kind of think in part 2, given how late it comes within part 2, he probably could actually have explained it, and they needed to find something better than him just going, no. Not least because I think by that point, Pike would have said yes, where before he'd said no, and that might have made a difference as well. Mm-hmm. And Spock could have said something like, given an explanation, and said something like, I can give you a partial explanation. Then explained and then said, but you might need to see to believe me.
But 1964, The Cage was filmed, which it's pretty progressive for 1964. I think it's fair to say, even with its limitations now, looking through 2022 eyes.
Yeah, I mean, I think the limitations it's got are, like I said, it's science fiction written in our past, trying to tell us what our future will be. And that's not unique to The Cage or Star Trek. It's a science fiction thing.
And finally, we get to hear what Purry thought of Part 2.
Hello, Args. Purry here to talk about the Menagerie Part 2. Not The Cage, as I said in a previous outtake. Although it is The Cage. Let's face it, the bulk of this one is The Cage with commentary from Kirk, Spock, and the occasional beeps from Pike. There's really not much to say about this. They do use the framing device a bit. They have kind of snipped The Cage down a little for time, I'm guessing, and to fit in the bits of trial that we had. But ultimately, it's The Cage. There's not much I can say about it. There are occasional bits. There's the bit where, again, like I say, I've got to admit it, my focus wasn't 100% on this. I was drifting. We did have Pike nod off at some point through the trial, which is fair enough. I felt the same way. I think they just paused occasionally to sort of say things or recap what was happening on screen or that sort of thing, and then cut back. It was only really near the end that anything happened, and essentially, as it turns out, the whole plan was to get Pike there so he could, I'm guessing, live the illusion of being a fit, healthy young man, and be with Vina, who presumably, basically they're both kind of almost, well, she's not an invalid, but she's, old and a bit hunchbacked. My wife, she's not watched The Cage much. I only seen bits of it, but she did say, alright, so because Vina's not particularly good looking, they don't take her back. I was like, yeah, that's essentially it from The Cage. I do actually wonder why no one does say, what the hell, Chris, when they find out that instead of being a starship captain, he decided he wanted to trade in sex slaves. Surely someone should have, what, really? You go from that to that? Oh, weird. But other than that, like I say, this was really just a rewatch of The Cage. I think the annoying thing was the fact that the trial didn't actually happen. As it turns out, the Commodore was on the starbase the whole time, and he was just another Telosian illusion. That sort of thing's just really disappointing at the end. It's almost like to build up the tension, because they wanted to have that bit where everyone calls Spock guilty at one point, and it looks like to build up the tension they kind of had to have this trial and this idea that Spock could be put to death, Kirk could lose his command and possibly be put to death. They tried to build that up with the trial, but then at the end saying, oh no, it was actually all a Telosian illusion, they were in control the whole time, and this was all basically them and Starfleet more or less emailing to say, since you're there, and we've also been watching The Cage as well, and so you do what you like, basically. That's kind of, it just made the whole thing feel, quite frankly, a bit pointless. I know we don't expect long-lasting repercussions from a 1960s TV series. It just didn't happen back then. This was TOS. Episodes go day by day, and genuinely people didn't expect to be watching repeats. But it just does make the whole episode feel kind of pointless. Also, did Gene Roddenberry's name come up before the episode finished? Did it look like someone jumped the gun in the credits and they just thought, balls to it, let it in? Because I think that's it. I think this all has a bit of a feeling of, just throw something together, fill 2 episodes, use that old pilot and bung in some stuff. I don't know, a trial, but you're not allowed any new sets, new costumes, and you're allowed 1 guest actor. That's kind of how it felt, and it just all feels a bit half-assed, quite frankly. So yeah, a bit of a disappointing run, but I'll be back again to feedback on whatever's coming next, because I think we're getting close to Picard's season. You did say something on the Borg Rogers one. But aside from that, I will feed back on whatever's coming, hopefully. As usual, do keep up the good work. I do always look forward to the podcast, and I'll talk to you guys on another time. But until then, bye for now.
Boy,
you. Yeah, I think they kind of ran out of time at the end, didn't they?
Yeah.
The credits started coming up before the episode ended. It was ironic, considering it felt a bit padded at times, but there we go. And the Mendez was an interesting character until it turns out he wasn't
really
there. Which is disappointing, I think it's fair to say, and pointless. I don't see why you needed to do that.
And once you realise that the trial didn't actually happen, it's very frustrating. You feel very cheated, don't you?
It was all a dream.
Oh, it's like, oh, fuck off. What you actually want is for the trial to have been happened, but Spock to have been exonerated.
Yes, exactly, because he did the right thing.
Yeah.
Which kind of also happens. That's the stupid thing about it. It's like,
I know.
I think half-assed is probably a very good description of it, actually.
I think so. Yes.
Yeah. But I do stand by my comment. This is the best way to watch The Cage, because The Cage is Dolesville, so,
Okay.
At least this has a bit more going for it.
A bit.
A bit, not much. Anyways, as Puri indicated, we're drawing close to Picard. Next month we'll be showing, and that has a knock-on effect because it's a weekly. We won't be doing our other podcasts, so it'll be Star Trek every week on this podcast for the first time in a long while, I think. But until such time, we have a couple more episodes of original series to cover. And obviously, once Picard's finished, unless they immediately start another one we can actually watch, which I don't think they're going to, we shall be returning to the original series. Don't worry, we won't be abandoning it. But 17th of February, we shall be covering Shore Leave. Giant white rabbits. Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's an interesting one.
Right.
One of the more out there episodes, I think it's fair to say.
Okay. I'm not going to say anything in case I'm wrong, but either it's the one I remember, which is like, I haven't taken enough drugs for this episode.
Slightly.
Or there's another episode where I haven't taken enough drugs for this episode.
There are a few of them, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Either is possible.
More as you go on. But yes, I think this is probably the first instance of Star Trek really going out there, I think, from what I remember. Okay, folks. Until then, cheery bye.
Bye.
Here in my menagerie, wonder what the world can be. Color, all the pleasure. Find a match made to measure. Join in my menagerie. Love's waiting for you and me. My menagerie. Imagine what will be. A world for you and me. In my menagerie.
The opening music for this podcast was provided by the talented Drew Barker.
The artwork was created by Andy Palastides.
All music referenced is for illustrative purposes only, and no copyright infringement is intended.
Find our website at borgcast.libsyn.com.
And we have a YouTube channel as well.
You can find the Borgcast playouts on Spotify for your listening pleasure.
Visit our Tumblr site at borgcast.tumblr.com, where you'll find images accompanying the episodes discussed in this cast.
Send emails or MP3s to borgcast@gmail.com.
Or you can contact us via Twitter on rev_org or borgcastammo. #Borgcast.
Shut it down!